All right, let's write another writing task 1, another essay from IELTS Academic 13. This one is also a bar chart. I will walk you through 6 steps to write a good answer for it. All right, first we need to understand the statement. Let's read it together. The chart below shows the percentage of households in owned and rented accommodation in England and Wales between 1918 and 2011. So as you know, we have 2 tasks to do. One, to summarize the information. How? By selecting and reporting the main features only, which means we cannot write every single point from the graph. And 2, to make comparisons where relevant. It means we need to compare the data and use the language of comparison. In doing so, we should write at least 150 words to be able to cover all the main features. All right, so we learned that it's about households, the percentage, not the number of households in owned and rented accommodation, which means places where people live. So it's not just house or apartment, it could be accommodation in different forms. And we have 2 countries here, England and Wales, between 1918 and 2011. So both of them are about the past, so we need to use past forms for it. All right, let's continue. The second step, to understand the data and plan before writing. So let's look at it together. We have households in owned accommodation in gray color and households in rented accommodation in black. As you can see here, we have the percentages, and here we have the period or the years, right? So it shows change over time, which means we have a dynamic chart, and we need to use the language of change, right? Okay, at this stage, we don't think too much about vocabulary. Just simply say up, down to know the changes. Let's begin with households in owned accommodation in gray color. So in 1918, it's around 20, then up in 1939, then the same, 1953, then goes up, again up till 2001, which gets to the highest part, and then goes down in 2011. So at the beginning of the period, it was around 22%. And at the end of the period, it got to around 60%. So it went up over the period. Now, if we connect the dots, you can see this upward trend for the first group. Now, let's focus on the second one, households in rented accommodation in black. So at the beginning of the period, we have it around 78%, then goes down, stays kind of the same, then down till 2001, gets to the lowest point and stays the same in 2001, and in 2011 it goes up again. So if we connect the dots here, you can see that it goes down a lot from around 80% to around 30%, which is a big change. So one more time, the first one up and the second one down. So about the overview, we can say that overall, the percentage of households in owned accommodation went up a lot, while the percentage of households in rented accommodation went down a lot. So of course, these two are very informal. We need to make them formal. Another thing that we can add to the overview and stands out is the year 1971. Why? Because both percentages are equal at this specific point or in this year, which is around 50%. So this is something that you can also mention in the overview. So let's move on. Step 3, I will write the paraphrase. Okay, so this is a statement and this is my paraphrase. The chart illustrates the proportion of households living in owned versus rented accommodation in England and Wales from 1918 to 2011. So the first change I deleted below, again, because there is nothing below my writing. Instead of shows, I used illustrates. Instead of the percentage of households, I used the proportion of households. Instead of in owned and rented accommodation, I used living in owned versus rented accommodation. And instead of between 1918 and 2011, I used from this to that year. All right, it's time to write the overview. Remember, overview is very important and you have to write it. You can write it right after your paraphrase or at the end of your writing. But it is better to write it right after your paraphrase because you may forget writing that. Okay, this is the paraphrase, and now let's add the overview. Remember that I said households in owned accommodation went up a lot, and households in rented accommodation went down a lot. So these are informal, and now we need to make them formal. So I'll write something like this. Overall, there was a significant shift from rented to owned accommodation. In the first half of the period, most households rented their accommodation, but this trend reversed over the following decades. So in order to make it more specific, we need to add one more point. Remember, we talked about 1971, which is an important year. So I will add this also to my overview. Notably, in 1971, the percentages of the two types of accommodation were equal. Now it's time to write the changes in a logical manner in body paragraphs. So you have different options here. Option one, you can actually write one paragraph for each group. I mean, one paragraph on households in owned accommodation and one paragraph on rented accommodation. Or you can mix them up. I usually separate them and write separate paragraphs, but for this one, I've decided to write them together and compare them in one paragraph. So I will mention one point about owned accommodation and compare it with rented accommodation. So this is the way I've decided to describe the data as another sample on this channel. So let's read it together. From 1918 to 1939, there was a slight decrease in the percentage of rented households, falling from approximately 78% to 69%. So I mentioned these 2 years, and now I want to compare it with owned accommodation. While the percentage of owned households rose modestly from about 22% to just over 30%. So remember I said we cannot report every single point from the graph. We need to group the data, the parts that are similar. For this part, we can group 1953 to 1971 because we had a downward trend, right? So we can write them together instead of mentioning them one by one. The trend continued more markedly post 1953 as the percentage of owned households began to increase significantly, reaching equal levels to rented households by 1971. During this year, both rented and owned accommodations accounted for roughly 50% of households. Since the percentages are not accurate, I use words like roughly, about, and approximately. Now let's continue with the second part. By 1981, 60% of households were owned. Now let's move on with 1991 and 2001. This upward trend in ownership continued, peaking at about 70% in 2001. So I mentioned the highest point, which is this part in 2011, leaving rented accommodation at about 30%, this part. Now let's continue with the last part of the graph. However, there was a slight decline in home ownership, decreasing to around 65% by 2011, while rented accommodation increased to approximately 35%. So I mentioned all the main changes and tried to compare the data, mentioning the most important points. Again, you cannot write every single point. Why? Because the question clearly asks you to summarize the information and select the main or the most important points. Now, let's talk about some of the useful phrases and vocabulary I use to describe the data. Illustrate means to show. Proportion, the number or amount of a part of something when compared to the whole. A significant shift, this combination is adjective plus noun, which is very useful, and you can use it in your writing task 1 essays. A significant shift, a big change. Trend, a general direction in which something is developing or changing over time. Reversed, changed to the opposite direction or condition. Equal, being the same in quantity, size, value, or status as something else. Now the first body paragraph. A slight decrease, again adjective plus noun. A small reduction in the number or amount. Fall from number to number. Here we have fall from 78% to 69%. This one is a very useful phrase. Moving down from one quantity to another. Approximately, roughly, or about, close to an exact amount. Rose modestly. So this is the second combination. Verb plus adverb. You need to use both of them, both adjective plus noun and verb plus adverb, to give variety to your writing. So this one means increased slightly. About, close to a certain amount, but not exactly that amount. Again, this is a synonym for around, roughly, and approximately. Just over, slightly more than a specific amount or number. Markedly, noticeably, or significantly. Post and then the year, after a specific year. Increase significantly, again verb plus adverb. A notable rise in quantity or amount. To get to a particular level, condition, or value. Accounted for, made up or represented a particular proportion. And the last one, roughly, again about, around, approximately. And the last paragraph, peak at, reach the highest point or maximum level. A slight decline, again adjective plus noun, a small or minor decrease or reduction. Around, approximately, or roughly. I wrote 185 words for this essay, and I organized it in 3 paragraphs. In the first one, I paraphrased the statement and wrote the overview. And in the next 2 body paragraphs, I described the changes. But for this one, I combined both parts, both groups of the data. I mean, both rented and owned accommodation. All right, hope you found it useful. Have a nice day.